Spider-Man, No More, originally published January 15, 2010, a weekly column, intermission. I'm an insect who dreamt he was a man, and loved it. But now that dream is over, and the insect is awake. Seth Brundle, David Cronenberg's The Fly. Though barely 2 weeks and change old, the 2010 entertainment news scene already seems to have found its theme, major talent being, to put it mildly, royally screwed over by seemingly clueless studio bosses in shockingly public displays. On the TV side, Conan O'Brien finds himself paying for NBC's earth-shattering Jay Leno show blunder, somehow being treated even more disrespectfully than even Letterman was the last time The Tonight Show changed hands. On the film side, director Sam Raimi, under whose stewardship the Spider-Man movies set scads of box office records and likely spearheaded the creation of the superhero-dominated blockbuster landscape of 21st-century Hollywood, got into a highly covered fight with Sony Pictures over the choice of bad guys for the upcoming Spider-Man 4. When it became clear he wasn't going to budge, at least, not in time to meet a scheduled start date, Sony's response was decisive, to say the least. Sony killed the movie and the series, announcing that not only would they replace Raimi but completely restart the entire franchise, with a new origin, a story following a teenaged Peter Parker in high school and, of course, an entirely new cast and continuity. Deadline Hollywood broke the story. And then the story broke the internet. Spider-Man, at least, the Spider-Man whose story moviegoers around the world had been following since 2001, is done for. The story is over. The giant question mark hovering over the relationship of Peter and Mary Jane will remain unresolved, as will the fate of the still-at-large Flint Marko, aka Sandman. Dylan Baker's Dr. Connors character will never make his constantly teased metamorphosis into the Lizard. Is Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin as unable to remain dead as his comic counterpart? We'll never know. The implications are, even for the world of blockbuster movie making, staggering. A film franchise ranked as one of the all-time most successful, not even a full decade old, the last installment of which earned over $300 million in the US alone and only came out 2.5 years ago, is being remade. Not merely recast, completely rebooted as though it had been gone and forgotten for years already. We won't know for years exactly what happened to get the situation to this point, but make no mistake, this is a big one. Books, plural, will be written about this, but it's easily one of the biggest what the fuck moments in modern movie history. Not only in scope, but also in how publicly it all played out over the last few years. Anyone with an internet connection and even a cursory interest in the Spider-Man movies has known since the week after the disappointing, but not as bad as everyone says it is, damn it. Spider-Man 3 came out that much of the film's now legendary story and pacing problems came from the studio forcing Raimi to include the popular, but largely useless, character Venom as a secondary villain largely against his will. But, then, this had been the story of the series from the beginning. In the now distant days of the millennial turn, fans were bracing themselves for, among other apocryphal permutations, the possibility of Freddie Prinze Jr. in a Chris Columbus-directed Abomination, or Arnold Schwarzenegger as Doc Ock for James Cameron, and you don't even want to know what kind of horrors were to be visited on Spidey's costume. The selection of movie geek cult icon Raimi was a megaton bomb of heaven-sent good news to the fanboy set. I remember myself and 4 other ostensibly grown men, all of us on-duty video store clerks, literally jumping up and down for joy upon hearing the news, and the results were like some kind of dream, a lavish, heartfelt translation of the Lee/Ditko Spider-Man, complete with a perfectly cast Tobey Maguire in the most accurately translated superhero outfit since Christopher Reeve. Raimi, so went the legends, had saved us all from what Sony Pictures thought a Spider-Man movie ought to be. Subsequently, anyone also following the development of the 4th film had heard that the same old rift between director and studio was happening all over again. Still smarting from the mess the shoehorning of Venom made of Spider-Man 3, Raimi was, allegedly, keen to refocus the villain roster on the golden age 1960s Spidey foes he preferred over 1990s grim and gritty standbys like Venom, or Carnage, who's basically Venom but somehow even less interesting, specifically the Vulture. This evidently didn't sit well with Sony, and rumors flew that they were angling for the inclusion of Spidey's comic paramour the Black Cat in the story, never mind the fact that they just did Tempted by Other Woman in the last movie, though, admittedly, the sight of the rumored Anne Hathaway filling out a flesh and blood Felicia Hardy would have certainly helped gloss over a lot of story issues. Whatever happened between Flash and Bang no one has, publicly, revealed, but the final result looks an awful lot like both sides calling each other's bluff. Raimi walked away, presumably to dive into production on his World of Warcraft movie. and the producers immediately declared intentions for a back-to-school reboot of the series, which they already had a writer and script for. Meaning, for those less conversant with the business, that they'd been planning this in some form for likely several months. Even still, the maneuver on Sony's part represents a rare confluence of cynical market-driven groupthink and legitimate risk-taking. Start over, cast younger certainly worked, from a profit standpoint, at least, for J.J. Abrams' slicked-up/dumbed-down Star Trek reboot, guaranteed to be the #1 example cited by Sony all the way through production on this new film. But if nothing else, going for a full reboot rather than just continuing with or without the original cast, let's face it, while a fine actor, Tobey Maguire isn't the movie star, Spider-Man is, would have been a safer, less controversial move to mainstream audiences than outright starting from scratch. Theory and speculation as to the studio's ultimate motive already runs rampant. Comic book resources, along with many others, see shades of Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man in the Teen Spidey angle, a wholly likely prospect that, quite frankly, makes me physically ill, while Chuck offers a grimmer but also entirely plausible theory. Sending Peter Parker back to school allows Sony to turn the franchise into their entry on the angsty teens with superpowers Twilight bandwagon. Ugh. But, whatever. The net benefit of geek properties now being so entrenched in the popular culture is that likely disasters like this are no longer as devastating to fanboys, well, to this fanboy, anyway, as they are to the careers of the decision makers. Fourth movie or not, Raimi's films were never going to be the last movies about Spider-Man, and the same will hold true for the Smallvilleized, CW-style turd Sony is now fixing to polish. I'll live to see good movies about Spider-Man again, and so will most of us. Still, it's all kind of perfectly tragic in its own way. Overall, the current blockbuster business is a kind of wish dream for lovers of comic superheroes, a world where people are surprised when a movie about Batman doesn't get nominated for Best Picture, where big-name Oscar-winning actors are campaigning for cape and cowl roles instead of the other way around, and where a planned set of Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, and Captain America movies all cross over with one another in a predetermined build-up to a giant-scaled Avengers film. None of this would be happening without the impact of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films, but now Spidey has to die on the mountain like Moses, watching his descendants cross into the promised land, tortured by Sony, much the same as I'm torturing this corny biblical analogy. In a way, watching this story unfold has felt like being a minor witness to a death, not of a movie franchise, but of a dream. While it's unfair to judge something sight unseen, it's hard to not notice that the now proposed hip, young, with-it Spider-Man sounds like exactly the kind of lowest common denominator tripe comic fans, and gamers, and otaku, and, well, genre fans in general, used to always have to prepare to see their icons reduced to by the studio machine, which is why, in turn, we were so elated that Sam Raimi had gotten the job and why his movies, the first two, especially, looked and felt like something out of a dream. Watching this slow-motion implosion play out, on the other hand, is akin to waking from a dream and remembering that you don't like the real world much at all. Ah, well. Rest in peace, good Spider-Man movies. We never really know what we have until it's gone.
The hardest thing about film criticism in an age of 24/7 entertainment media coverage is separating out the appraisals about the business side of movies from the artistic side, endeavoring as best as one is able to keep opinions about the occasionally less than admirable people and frequently less than noble process involved in making a film with the film itself. Sometimes, though, a certain acknowledgement of those factors just can't be avoided, particularly in cases where what has gone wrong with a finished movie is so clearly tied to the business of making it. Case in point, The Amazing Spider-Man, a rancid, terrible, stiflingly inept, torturous to sit through piece of shit whose every second of its unforgivably overlong running time feels like the worst kind of passionless, cynical, mechanical, soulless, assembly line, commercially focused corporate filmmaking, precisely because it is the worst kind of passionless, cynical, mechanical, soulless, assembly line, commercially focused corporate filmmaking. Here we have a film that exists not because somebody desperately wanted to tell a story or bring a beloved character to life, to experiment with some new kind of visual storytelling, or even just because they thought there'd be a huge profit in it, but in order to fill out a balance sheet. The Sony Corporation is obliged to keep the lights on at the Spider-Man department lest Marvel/Disney start asking for their toys back, And starting the series over with a newer, cheaper set of actors and a presumably more obedient director was the quickest way for them to do so. To call this filmmaking by committee would be doing disservice to the idea of committees. This is filmmaking by accountants. But to be fair, good things can be salvaged out of these circumstances. After all, a similar situation led to Matthew Vaughn's magnificent X-Men First Class last year. But whereas that project was blessed by a lucky combo of talent and drive, The Amazing Spider-Man is poisoned by a lethal cocktail of ineptitude, laziness, and terrible decision-making. Peter Parker may play fast and loose with the laws of gravity, but he can't escape the laws of Murphy. Everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. The only thing that saves it from being a Green Lantern-level disaster is that it's too boring and has too little ambition for anyone to stay angry at it for very long. The reimagined story drops Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy back into high school, where she is a popular science prodigy and he is a complete cipher, actually. More on that in a bit. Now, this isn't in itself a bad idea, nor is the fact that it takes about an hour of Twilight-inspired but Saved-by-the-Bell executed teenage romantic angst before most of the Spider-Man stuff kicks in. Taking time to establish complex characters and differentiate the world of this new story from the earlier Sam Raimi films would actually be the smart way to go. Unfortunately, neither of those things actually happen. Andrew Garfield is a promising young actor, but whatever talent he may possess is crushed by a horrible screenplay that never figures out who Peter Parker is other than not the guy from the comics and not Tobey Maguire. Depending on the scene, he's either a slacker, an emo kid, a wise ass, a skater, or a mumbling depressive doing someone's idea of a Michael Cera impression. The other characters are completely one note and not even in the archetypal way that can sometimes work in a superhero movie. Only Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy feels like she has any dimension, as she's both a thankless love interest and a convenient plot device. The supposed hook of the film is a new, slick, modernized version of the Spider-Man origin story, but the result is a total washout. We've seen the familiar parts done so much better multiple times before, and the new shocking revelation stuff is across the board awful, alternating between the wrong-headed and the laughably coincidental. Peter Parker's late father just so happens to have been a famous scientist whose ex-partner just so happens to be Curt Connors, aka the Lizard, and they just so happen to have been working for Norman Osborn, and their experiments just so happen to be part of the stuff that turns Peter into Spider-Man. Oh, and Gwen Stacy just so happens to be Curt Connors' assistant. Wow. This kind of reductive character charting probably makes sense to structure-fixated studio producers, but it only serves to make what should be a sprawling world of immense possibilities feel small and unimportant while robbing Peter somewhat of the accidental everyman hero aspect of his personality that's the most important part of his character. Even worse, someone somehow thought that it would be a good idea to mess around with the details of Uncle Ben's tragic fate, completely gutting that all-important plot point of its thematic meaning. I was damn near speechless at that point. How do you f*** that up? Not that it matters, since the film is much more interested in giving Spidey an all-new motivation involving the mystery of his birth parents' probably not accidental death, which the film shamelessly teases as a grand mystery to be played out over future sequels, which, if the movie gods have any benevolence left, we will hopefully never have to see. Great power, great responsibility, who needs that when there's so much of Batman Begins yet to rip off? You'll notice I haven't talked much about our villain, the Lizard, yet, and that's because there really is nothing to talk about. Just like Peter, the awful screenplay can't decide what Curt Connors is, other than sad about having only one arm, and since the film is much more concerned with its boring romance and pathetic attempts at world-building, he's made to act out the most cliched supervillain arc possible. An early hint that they might be positioning Lizard as a misunderstood anti-hero was dropped without explanation, and instead, transforming into a giant iguana also inexplicably turns Dr. Connors into a reptilian fascist who wants to conquer the world. Because. The film literally has no idea what this character is supposed to be about, other than giving the film some kind of stakes for a badly staged final action sequence. Speaking of which, the whole enterprise looks terrible. The CGI Lizard looks worse than the Gary Oldman monster from the end of Lost in Space, and most of the action scenes take place in an ugly, lens flare-saturated nighttime shots as part of a grating attempt to effect yet another tiresome, grim and gritty feel. I don't know when I've seen a movie this allegedly expensive look this cheap and shoddy, and it doesn't help that poor Andrew Garfield has to slog through it in the worst-looking superhero costume since Catwoman. Oh, and I'd love to know just what genius thought giving the web shooters a muzzle flare would be just badass. The action scenes are almost a saving grace, with the web-slinging scenes being a lone improvement from the original films. It's just too bad he's never swinging off to do anything interesting. Also, someone seems to have made the ridiculous decision to start caring about where exactly the webs are attaching to all the time, which leads to a big set-piece moment in the finale that's obviously meant to be moving and inspiring on the level of Spider-Man 2's infamous train sequence, but instead plays out as literally
the stupidest thing that has ever happened in a Spider-Man movie.
Yes, including this. The Amazing Spider-Man is not the worst movie I've seen or will see this year, but it's hard to imagine one more contemptible. This is the kind of movie that has absolutely no respect for the material it's based on or the audiences it's hoping to appear before. It's a riskless, artless, meaningless endeavor that exists only on the premise that even the laziest Spider-Man movie will still turn a profit simply by being a Spider-Man movie. I'd like to think that calculation is wrong. I'd love to see this worthless heap bomb as hard and heavy as it deserves to, maybe teaching Hollywood a lesson about taking an audience for granted in the process. process, but that probably won't happen. All I can do is sit here and tell you, the potential members of that audience, that The Amazing Spider-Man sucks, and that as both a movie lover and a fan of Spider-Man for as long as I can remember, that really, really pisses me off. See you next time. So, by now plenty of you have probably had a chance to go and see The Amazing Spider-Man. I mean, you shouldn't, given that it's a terrible, terrible movie, but let's not kid ourselves. It's pretty much the big movie right now. It's hot outside, and even if you haven't already figured that it looked bad from the trailers, you can't really ignore the opportunity to see how Sony's inexplicable reboot plan actually shakes out. I mean, I had to see it because it's my job, but I probably would have seen it anyway. Now, since this movie already came out in the middle of the week, the actual review episode already ran. If you missed it, you can watch it here. What this is going to be is more of an immediate post-mortem. See, The Amazing Spider-Man is bad, but it's kind of intriguingly bad. The places it trips up and the wrong turns it makes seem baffling when you consider the amount of money and talent in play, and it would seem to merit a slightly more in-depth analysis than just, this movie doesn't work. Now, for example, the film's bad guy, the Lizard, doesn't work at all. His motivation is confusing, his personality changes without much indication as to why. The film can't make up its mind as to whether he was always evil or adequately explain why turning into a lizard makes you want to turn everyone else into a lizard. But I don't feel like it's fair to get into that just yet. There are just so many go-nowhere plot threads in this movie, almost all of which directly involve the Lizard, that it feels truly like the rumors of massive rewrites and reshoots cutting big chunks out of the movie were probably correct. So it's probably going to be a while before we can gauge what truly went wrong with the bad guy. What I can dig into, however, is what seems to have gone wrong with a more important element, the good guy. The biggest reason that Amazing Spider-Man doesn't work is that it doesn't get the Amazing Spider-Man. Now, I want to be very clear, I'm not talking about Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker not being the same character as Tobey Maguire's. That would be pointless. It's a reboot. I'm also not necessarily put out by the fact that they've completely jettisoned the original comics version. Like it or not, early 60s dweeby science nerd Peter would be an anachronism in the 21st century. And while I think the Sam Raimi films made the correct decision in going for a stylized world that tried to merge 60s comics characters with a modern setting, it's understandable that this reboot would want to create its own unique version of the character. What's unfortunate is that they didn't really bother to do that. Just as the rest of the film is soulless, mechanical fusion of formula story beats, ideas, and even whole sequences lifted from other popular movies, the new Spider-Man is a cynical character sheet Frankenstein. Specifically, he feels very much like an attempt to turn Spider-Man into Batman and Peter Parker into Edward Cullen. In the new version of the origin story, instead of using his new powers for self-enrichment, indirectly causing the death of his Uncle Ben and dedicating his life to crime-fighting as penance, Peter Parker now causes said death by being immature, then becomes a vigilante as part of a single-minded quest to avenge that death, until a stern talking to about vigilantism sends him on a broader crime-fighting path. Sound familiar? It should. It's the plot of Batman Begins. But okay, while disappointing, it's not at all surprising that a superhero movie without any inspiration of its own would just borrow inspiration from the most popular other guy in the genre. The bigger problem, the one that ultimately sinks the film in places where it really counts, is that the new Peter Parker is a mess of a character. It might seem like a cheap shot to raise the specter of modern Hollywood's most hated franchise, but what's up on screen is what's up on screen, and what's up on screen feels a lot like a fishing expedition for residual Twilight dollars. And not just because it's a movie about a girl who falls in love almost immediately with a hunky, mysterious, dangerous dude who's actually a superhuman creature who sneaks into her bedroom and whom her policeman father disapproves of. I mean, Gwen Stacy's father was a policeman in the comics, too. In fact, I wonder if that's what made the light bulb go off over at Sony at the first place. It's more about the way Peter is characterized. He's no longer strictly a nerd, fine, but other than his awkwardness around this one girl, he's not really much of an outsider or even unusual. He's a bitter, mopey teenager in an era where bitter and mopey is the cool affect for teenagers. When we first meet him, he's already a snarky, aggressive guy who fights back against bullies and throws around wise-ass remarks. In other words, there's no difference anymore between the Spider-Man persona and the Peter Parker persona. In fact, he already pretty much seems to be Spider-Man before he gets his powers. He doesn't change at all as a character over the course of the film, other than to learn a lesson that amounts to don't be a jerk all the time, because apparently with great power comes great responsibility doesn't exist anymore. Now, this doesn't make much sense from a creative screenwriting standpoint, but it makes perfect sense from a marketing standpoint. It really does feel like Sony wanted this to be the sexy, smoldering, teenage romance version of Spider-Man. And geeky, awkward science nerds are not sexy or smoldering. Dangerous yet boy band handsome loners with secret night lives are sexy and smoldering. So that's what the new Peter Parker is. Unfortunately, if the filmmakers did take a microscope to Twilight in conceiving their new Spidey, they missed the most important part. The reason Edward is able to more or less pull off, at least in terms of his audience anyway, being a one-dimensional 12th generation James Dean pastiche is that he's not the main character or the main narrative perspective of those movies. A film can survive a lot of things: bad structure, bad acting, bad effects, bad music, but not a bad main character. Somebody wanted Spider-Man to be new, slick, and sexy. Instead, he's just boring, and that somebody pretty much killed this movie. See you next time. So there's a trailer now for The Amazing Spider-Man 2. It looks not good, mostly because it looks like Amazing Spider-Man 1, which was not good. But we'll find out in like 5 months when I review it. Right now, I want to talk about villains, specifically in relation to how people have reacted to the villains shown off by the trailer and poster for this movie. You see, as far as anyone had known previously, the main focus of this movie bad guy-wise was going to be Jamie Foxx as Electro, with possible setups happening for other bad guys since Chris Cooper and Dane DeHaan are on hand as Norman and Harry Osborn respectively, and because Sony already committed to making 2 more of these things. But then the poster came out, and not only are we seeing Electro and the Rhino, who's apparently just a big robot now, because that's not boring, but also a teeny-weeny shot of Dane DeHaan looking very much like the Green Goblin, the Hobgoblin, or perhaps just Harry Osborn using weapons that will later be used by the Green Goblin. And then came the trailer. Hey, there's the robot Rhino, there's Electro, and there's DeHaan's Goblin, or Feyd-Rautha maybe. And there's also Shadowy Man in the Hat from the weird stinger at the end of the first movie, conspicuously walking past. Oh, I know what those are for. Don't even start. If it's in the trailer, it's not a spoiler, especially if it's a gratuitous, look at me, won't I make a great screen cap, shot like this. The point is, the marketing campaign for this movie has clearly stopped being about, hey, we made another Spider-Man, in favor of, look how many bad guys we have, and we'll probably set up 2 or 3 more for the next one. Sony's marketing department clearly wants you to be thinking bad guy palooza when you think of this franchise going forward, and this movie in particular. In fact, they may or may not have booted the character of Mary Jane, originally set to be played by actress Shailene Woodley, to make room for more of this stuff. So why the change in emphasis? Well, because this whole genre now exists in the aftermath of the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Avengers. So if you're making superhero movies, the name of the game is telling audiences that you also have long-term universe-building multi-film arcs in the pipeline. That's why X-Men Days of Future Past hasn't even come out yet, and Bryan Singer is already teasing that the next movie is about Apocalypse. Or how the Man of Steel sequel is looking more and more like Justice League's prequel every day. As for Spider-Man, well, back to the trailer for a moment.
Protect the world from what I know they're capable of. The future.
6 doors with numbers in what looked like the same laboratory as the Wings and Tentacles. 6 as in Sinister Six, the moniker generally assigned to villain teams opposed to Spider-Man. Sony apparently wants you to know, or at least think, that they're effectively doing the Avengers in reverse, building up a team of bad guys versus one good guy. That's interesting, even if I kinda hate the idea that all of these characters are just gonna get some guy's prefab villain gear instead of their own origin, but that's for another time. Either way, just the implication, however misleading or not, that Amazing 2 will have multiple villains has sent some prospective viewers into fits of worry about that favorite chestnut of the genre, the too many villains problem. The assumption, as old as Batman Returns, that these movies in this genre don't generally work when there's more than one noteworthy nemesis on hand. This assumption has always struck me as a little on the strange side, since it only seems to come up in this one substrata of action movies. I mean, Die Hard has 13 villains, and sure, 12 of them are the henchmen to Hans Gruber's main villain, but Carl, Franco, Tony, Theo, Alexander, Marco, Christoph, Eddie, Uli, Heinrich, Fritz, and James all have names and discernible distinct personalities. James Bond usually has at least 2 or 3 specific bad guys to kill. Heck, it doesn't even hold for superheroes on television. The various incarnations of the Power Rangers always have a whole room full of scheming regular bad guys in addition to the monster of the week. The thing is, the movies where villain teams don't generally work seem to be the ones that don't think the arrangement through. Classic example, all 3 of the 2 villain original Batman movies struggled to find a good reason for these characters to A, team up, and B, share nearly equal screen time. Mostly because the movies, unlike the comics, don't have the advantage of taking place in worlds where these people are known to hang out in the same bars, attend the same parties, and otherwise establish professional relationships, but also because they still try to follow a comic-style co-equal team structure regardless, instead of the more sensible division of duties found in a conventional action movie. But some films in the genre do it right. Notable example, Batman Begins, which works perfectly well with 4 significant villains, using them as pieces of a broader mystery story. Seriously, think back on that movie. At first, the villain appears to be Ken Watanabe as the Japanese Ra's al Ghul, but then he's out of the picture early and the focus turns to bad guy number 2, the top Gotham mobster Carmine Falcone. But then Falcone turns out to have been largely manipulated by the corrupt psychiatrist Dr. Crane, aka the Scarecrow, bad guy number 3. Finally, we get our actual villain when Liam Neeson's Henry Ducard turns out to have been the real Ra's al Ghul. And then the sequel made 3 main bad guys work, and made it work largely because Two-Face was an important part of the story, but not one that required a lot of screen time. And while I'm not overly enthusiastic about the movie so far, I never bought into the too many villains thing as a rule, and I can see how this one might work it out. All the shots from the trailer of Paul Giamatti in his rhino armor look like part of the same action sequence. Maybe he only shows up at one point, just to establish that he exists for the next 2 movies. That'd leave plenty of room to do whatever it is they're doing with Electro, and have the Goblin show up to say, "See you guys in part 3, and I wouldn't be surprised if that business with the lab and the 6 doors isn't literally the last scene of the movie. Look, movies go wrong for all kinds of reasons, but there's no specific formula like numbers of antagonists that guarantees success or failure. If there was, everyone would use it. This movie doesn't look very good, but if it's not, it won't be because of how crowded the poster was. Yeah, I know there's supposed to be music. I just don't feel like music today, guys. Today I'm depressed. Just bring up the title. There you go. Oh god, the red. Guys, I can't look at the red right now. It reminds me of... Just hold on. Yeah, that suits my mood a little better. Okay then. So, the worst feeling in the world is when someone or something you love or even just enjoy lets you down, changes, turns into something you hate. Because suddenly there's this huge pieces of your world and your emotional psyche that now have negativity attached to them. Things that used to make you feel good don't anymore. And you're adrift. Me, I like Spider-Man. I love Spider-Man, in fact. Pretty much everything Spider-Man, even the bad stuff, always have, as long as I can remember. And I like movies, and I like that my job is watching movies and then talking about them. But in the moments after watching Amazing Spider-Man 2, I was so completely f***ing done with all of it. I didn't want to look at or even think about Spider-Man anymore. If there'd been any Spider-Man stuff of mine in the vicinity at the moment, I would have smashed it into bits out of spite. I didn't want to go near any comics, I didn't want to think the word superhero, I didn't want to watch any more movies, hell, I didn't want to come back and review this one. What I wanted to do more than anything in that moment for significantly longer than I'd like to admit was just quit movies, movie criticism, comics, the entire nerd ephemera, and just go off the grid and be a fisherman or something. Now, let me just be on record, yes, this is better than the first one. 2 years ago, the Sony Corporation chewed up and shit out my favorite superhero, smeared the results across movie screens, and called it a reboot. Now, that smear has at least dried out and crusted over so it doesn't smell as much or look as nasty, but yeah, it is still shit though. But to be fair, better is better. It's just that this time, the cumulative weight of things became horrifyingly clear for me. Like in those H.P. Lovecraft stories where someone actually catches a glimpse of the abyss and the sheer cosmic horror of it burns their very soul. See, Amazing Spider-Man 2 isn't really even a movie. My first instinct is to describe it as a 2.5-hour trailer, but that's being unfair to trailers. This is more like a super elaborate PowerPoint presentation for Sony shareholders, meticulously laying out the carefully calculated business model of Spider-Man movies for the foreseeable future. It doesn't have a cohesive main story, it doesn't have character arcs or even what you might call emotional weight as a human being might understand the term, but what it does have is the tangible promise of a clear plan for the sequels and spin-offs and tangents of an overall robust money-making line of film as product. I'm not trying to avoid talking about the story of the film, by the way, because there really isn't one. In terms of other superhero movies, ASM 2 bears the closest resemblance to the likes of Iron Man 2 in that its plot is a collection of largely disconnected story threads that relate to one another mostly through coincidence arranged into an order that gives the surface-level illusion of a 3-act structure. But here goes. So Spider-Man loves Gwen Stacy, but he's being prevented from truly committing because he's being haunted by the frowny, cock-blocking ghost of Dennis Leary, and also she might move to England for college anyway, so instead he gets back into solving the uninteresting mystery of his missing super scientist father that nobody cared about in the first movie and discovers he was involved in top-secret genetic engineering experiments to create boring versions of famous Spider-Man villains because somehow that's going to help cure the crippling hereditary disease that afflicted billionaire Oscorp founder Norman Osborn. Oh, and Osborn's teenage son Harry also has the same disease and happens to be Peter's best friend from childhood, which is weird because you think that would have come up in the first movie about Peter being obsessed with Oscorp, but it didn't. Oh well. Oh, and Harry thinks that Spider-Man's blood can cure him of the disease, but Peter won't help him because he's afraid it'll turn him into the Green Goblin, except turning you into the Green Goblin seems to actually be what the disease does anyway. Oh, and a nerdy Oscorp scientist named Max Dillon, who's obsessed with Spider-Man, gets bitten by electric eels and turns into Electro, who gets a bunch of scenes devoted to him, even though his storyline doesn't have anything structurally or thematically to do with all the other stuff, and he mostly just ends up being a henchman. Oh, and Harry does turn into a Green Goblin, but since they've already got this suit of power armor that makes him not die, it's cool, but he's still really mad about it anyway because, well, Well, because the movie has to end in a certain predetermined, heavily foreshadowed way that requires a Green Goblin to be on hand because reasons. Oh yeah, and apparently Oscorp is experimenting on inmates in an insane asylum, which Harry seems to be against, but then also seems to be in charge of, and apparently he's also in charge of the shadowy hat-wearing guy from the end of the first one, who I guess turns out to be the Gentleman. Oh, and Paul Giamatti shows up at the very beginning as a Russian gangster, and then again at the very end as the surprisingly crappy-looking robot version of the Rhino. Yeah, I know it sounds like I'm joking around here, folks, but it really does play out that convoluted and haphazard. I'm usually the first guy to get annoyed when stuffy, old-guard movie critics rail against Avengers-style movie intercontinuity or the franchise mentality as the death knell of cinema, but Amazing Spider-Man 2 is those folks' fears made flesh. 2.5 hours of movie, and almost none of it is anything other than franchise maintenance. Obvious ham-handed setups for Sony's next 6 or 7 years of summer blockbusters. Say what you will about the Marvel movies as mutual marketing apparatuses, at least they always work as individual movies of their own. This does not. And it's a shame because, again, it is better than the first one, and there is some stuff I liked in it, just not consistently. The stuff that's good is all minor details, and none of it sticks around very long. Yes, the web-slinging sequences are the best they've ever been. Yes, unquestionably, Garfield is wearing the best Spider-Man costume ever put on film, period. And while I'm sure there's going to be a lot of snarking about the use of a character-specific inner monologue dubstep track for Electro's theme music, I liked it. In fact, Electro's debut action scene is unquestionably the highlight of the movie, even though it's drowning in obnoxious Sony product placement and they've managed to turn one of Spider-Man's coolest-looking enemies into homeless Dr. Manhattan with a backstory ripped off from Jim Carrey in Batman Forever. But those tiny slivers of promise are resoundingly overwhelmed by the badness that surrounds them. The staging is as directionless as the story, and there's nothing solid for the actors to hang a performance on. And when it does decide, with about 10 minutes of movie left to go, that it's done advertising for its own sequels and wants to at least try to end like an actual film with a big emotional gut punch, it bungles it spectacularly. No, I won't say what specifically happens, but I will say that what should elicit a shocked gasp of abject horror instead drew instant spontaneous laughter from me and others in the theater. It plays like something out of a spoof of a hypothetical real ending, and if it was Mark Webb's decision to stage this scene this way, then I'd say it's now quite definitive that he really is just a bad filmmaker. And as I sat there watching this all tick by, like I said, the Lovecraftian staring into the abyss thing, my eyes glazed over, the clouds parted, and I could see the future of my career as a critic stretching out in front of me in the form of an endless succession of empty, meaningless Spider-Man sequels, and I just couldn't bear the thought of that. I don't like hating Spider-Man. I don't like sitting down to write a negative review like this and feeling like the kid at the end of Old Yeller having to put down the malformed, twisted remains of what used to be the thing he loved. I hate this movie. Yes, every bit as much as the first one, even while acknowledging that it's a marginal improvement. They're both still bad. I hate Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. I hate this entire vision of this character and his enemies in this world, and I hate seeing it badly directed on top of that, and badly written. And it all makes me so very, very tired, drained. Guys, I almost never go this far, but my magic lamp wish right now would be for this movie to fail. For everyone involved with it to fail. For this to somehow bomb so spectacularly that it just blows up the whole plan and Sony doesn't make any more of these. Not because I want the rights to revert back to Marvel so Spidey can be an Avenger or some fanboy nonsense crap. I just don't want there to be any more of these bad movies. Because they've finally done the impossible. They broke something in me. Amazing Spider-Man 2 made me sick and tired of Spider-Man. And I don't like how that feels.
I Told You So, originally published February 13, 2015, under my weekly column Intermission. Just about 5 years ago, I told you that Sony unceremoniously firing Sam Raimi and cancelling Spider-Man 4 was a terrible idea that would end in disaster. 2.5 years later, I was proven right. The Amazing Spider-Man was an unmitigated piece of shit. Last April, they did a sequel that was so bad everybody else started coming around to where I'd been since 2010. Since then, it's been my perverse duty to report on the fallout from all this. The hacked emails revealing Sony was already trying to get out of this by handing off to Marvel. The likelihood that Andrew Garfield was already toast as the lead character. Increasingly wild rumors of face-saving Hail Mary projects. Sony's Japanese masters likely forcing them to bow to Marvel's wishes. It's all quite fascinating, two hugely powerful companies effectively scrapping over a pair of red long johns like NFL teams over a free agent. And now, vindication. It's over. Marvel Comics' flagship superhero is finally going to join the cinematic universe where he belongs. In case you were wondering, yes, I imagine I will be insufferable about this for a good long while. The details, of course, are still emerging. The press release at Marvel's site talks about a new Spider-Man debuting in the MCU before a new series kicks off at Sony, which is why it's no surprise that Andrew Garfield is all but officially gone as Peter Parker. I can get behind that. Garfield is a good actor, and it's conceivable that he might have been a good Spider-Man with the right screenplay, but everything about the character was wrong conceptually and the actual writing/directing sealed his fate. His Spider-Man is the worst live-action incarnation to ever appear, and he's tainted irrevocably because of it. It'd be like George Clooney headlining Batman Begins. Predictably, a lot of people are already calling for this to be as good a moment as any to just not bother with Peter Parker and go with Miles Morales, the Black/Latino star of Ultimate Spider-Man. I could get behind that, but it's almost certainly not going to happen. Marvel's default cinematic brand, for the most part, is ripped from the comics, and I doubt they'll forego the opportunity to drive fans into a frenzy with the most Lee/Ditko/Romita accurate spy day ever, at least to start with. Especially since doing so lets them save and now, Miles Morales, as a big newsmaker when they decide to recast a few sequels from now. A lot of this is also bound up in Hollywood deal-making doublespeak. The announcement trumpets that Sony will retain creative control of solo Spider-Man movies going forward, with Marvel free to have the character turn up in cameos and co-star roles, but nobody actually believes that's truly the case. Sony is the only one making a substantial gain here. Marvel already owns the more financially lucrative parts of Spider-Man, merchandising and TV rights, and while they'd certainly like to have yet another hit movie franchise, they've by now proven that they can turn characters nobody has heard of into gargantuan moneymakers all on their own. Marvel's short-term, immediate gain here is control of a few news cycles, another guaranteed pop at the next SDCC when the new Spider-Man joins the Avengers etc. on stage, and a known quantity whose co-star/cameo stature can help sell an iffy project of their own, if it were to leak, for example, that at one point in Ant-Man the characters would be on hand in a science lab where a random teenager gets bit by an irradiated spider, and then that same kid turns up in a post-credits scene, seemingly developing spider powers. Suddenly, no one will be worried about Ant-Man's opening weekend numbers. If Agents of SHIELD was to end Season 2 on a stinger of director Coulson calling for a trip to New York because I want to know who this is and holding up a Daily Bugle Spider-Man headline, ABC wouldn't be able to greenlight a Season 3 fast enough. But Sony is getting the one thing that every movie studio in the world would kill for, an official endorsement from Marvel that audiences who want to keep up to date with the Marvel Cinematic Universe need to go see one of their, Sony's, movies, too. This is the unobtainium of Hollywood right now, so don't expect anything to happen on these new post-Amazing Spider-Man features without Marvel having said yes to it. It's even being speculated on the business front that this is in itself a halfway measure, a staging ground for either Marvel eventually acquiring Spy Day outright or Disney purchasing Sony Pictures. A missing question in a lot of this is whether or not mainstream audiences actually care. The sheer ubiquity of the Marvelization of the Hollywood blockbuster, and the internet age easy access to information that in part made it possible, has certainly changed the game in terms of how much casual moviegoers care about connective tissue. Millions more people are aware of, and nominally invested in, Guardians of the Galaxy and Iron Man taking place in the same universe by virtue of that one big purple guy having turned up in the Avengers than ever knew or cared about the gently suggested shared universe of some Quentin Tarantino films or even the self-reference obsessed Kevin Smith features. But does that investment extend to intellectual property rights disputes? Make no mistake, Spider-Man meeting Thor and Captain America on screen is the definition of a saleable spectacle in superhero blockbusters, particularly kids for whom the Marvel movies will now look one step closer to resembling a varied toy chest or their Disney Infinity lineups, or the Lego Movie. But is it a spectacle appreciably different from, say, Batman showing up? Or Godzilla? Or Mr. Spock? Or any other known quantity character of similar stature? The lifer Marvel/comic book devotees who fuel the between-movie fandom hype machine, and make up a plurality of the blogger base reporting on the same, are invested in seeing missing pieces like Peter Parker, Reed Richards, and mutants fitted back into the Marvel Universe. But can a wider audience for whom acknowledgement of there being a Marvel Universe begins with Samuel L. Jackson surprising Robert Downey Jr. in his living room be expected to care the same way? While the internet is celebrating a homecoming, are Joe and Jane Popcorn asking why it's supposed to be a big deal, or even good news, that a superhero whose last two movies were, to put it mildly, terrible now gets to join, or at least hang out with, the Avengers. It's all so iffy that, as glad as I am, and if the song up top didn't cue you in, I am euphoric, that I won't have to see my favorite superhero further sullied by Bob Orsi and Alex Kurtzman's moronic magic blood / predestination / cool athletic model handsome high schooler is treated like a dorky nerd for some reason but only sometimes screenwriting, Garfield's mush-mouth mumbling and whatever the hell Dane DeHaan thought he was doing as Harry Osborn. I'm still more interested than excited. I want to know which Marvel movie he'll show up first in, Captain America 3 Civil War like they were hoping / planning? Or will Marvel, who famously shot the Avengers' now iconic shawarma scene during a few hours when the necessary actors all happened to be in the same city and inserted it into the post-credits a week after the film had already premiered and released in Europe, cast the role in time for Mr. Stark? Peter Parker, Daily Bugle. Can we get a shot with the helmet open, to be a post-production insert for Avengers, Age of Ultron? But beyond that? Even with this new arrangement all but guaranteed to yield a better Spider-Man movie than I've gotten in a while, again, it won't exactly be difficult. I'm going to need to hear directors, actors, and scenarios before I start getting my hopes all the way up. After all, in 11 years almost no superhero movie made has managed to do better than this moment, but I'll at least never have to sit through this nonsense again.
Spider-Man Homecoming is finally out, and it's okay. It's just okay. It's fine, solid, somewhat disposable, but in no way malnutritious piece of entertainment with a handful of cool moments, a fun, forward-looking cultural vibe, and a game cast that makes up for a lot of its fairly minor shortcomings. You can see my full review right over here. I wouldn't call it so much a disappointment, since in practical terms, the only surprising things it could have conceivably done is be worse than the last two horrible Spider-Man movies, which it's not, or somehow better than the original Spider-Man movies, which it was never ever gonna be. Mostly it just feels inoffensively unambitious, a movie that never once feels the need to strain or stretch at proving itself a worthwhile endeavor, as though it wasn't keenly aware that it's going to make $1 billion pretty much just for existing. The most notable thing that it could be said to accomplish is acting as a proof of concept for the Spider-Man franchise integration into the broader Marvel Cinematic Universe, but that was already established a couple of movies ago, so what amounts to further cementing that fact shouldn't really be all that thrilling unless you're a shareholder in the Sony Corporation. And yet, let's face it, while there's nothing wrong with this or any other genre film being seemingly designed just to be watched, momentarily enjoyed, and then immediately forgotten about until the next one comes around, it has become an unusual phenomenon for a comic book movie, certainly one in the MCU, which is built around convincing audiences that they should at least feel obligated to keep track of where a bunch of dopey magic rocks are between films in order to get the full experience. But consider this, what if it were okay for the new Spider-Man movie not to be a big deal because, well, the new Spider-Man movie is not in and of itself a big deal? Now that's not the same thing as saying it isn't important to culturally relevant. As I mentioned before, this is effectively our third week covering it, so yes, it would appear that Homecoming is relevant as all hell. These are big pop touchstones that make up the basis of a shared cultural mythology which, in an age where technology and societal evolution are rendering our old definitions of tribe and nationality increasingly obsolete, it could be said to be forming the connective social tissue of the post-national 21st century. Like it or not, these giant multinational tentpole blockbusters matter as cultural objects potentially more than they have at any other time in our history. But that's talking about cultural presence, which is a different thing altogether from the actual weight and importance of a work itself. Spider-Man Homecoming as a film and a story doesn't really matter all that much because it's not really trying to. It doesn't only lack much in the way of substance, it actually avoids trying to have substance in the first place. From the ground up, it's a film pitched as a side project, even as it's ostensibly the start of the main project for the title character. The three most important things that generally happen to Peter Parker, getting his powers, whatever happened to Uncle Ben in this timeline, and getting tapped to intern with the Avengers, all either happen off-screen or in a previous adjacent movie. Aunt May finding out that Peter is Spider-Man, usually one of the biggest plot points conceivable in any version of this material, gets tossed off in Homecoming as a last-minute gag to send the audience home laughing. It doesn't want to have depth or consequence, it just wants to be a fun diversion. And you know what? That's okay. Not all these things have to be these big, sweeping, grandiose epics. Yes, the Sam Raimi films were, and those were great, but the Amazing films actively tried to copy that and were cheap because of it. Homecoming isn't even all that concerned about the faux complexity world-building of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, even though officially declaring these as the Sony movies you have to see in order to keep up with the Disney movies you actually want to see is the entire reason for it to exist. It's helpful to remember that even though we've blown them up into Hollywood demigodhood this new century, comic book superheroes weren't initially built to be important. Good creators creators were able to make them important over time in fits and starts, but we're still mostly talking about a subgenre that was designed to sell weekly magazines half filled with advertisements to children for pocket change, churned out assembly line style mostly by journeymen making working class salaries. In that respect, Homecoming, being a quickie one-off story whose main overriding focus is selling you on how much fun Spider-Man is so you'll want to buy a ticket to more of him, is actually much closer to the foundational DNA of the genre than something like Batman v Superman or even Civil War, both of which strain in the direction of being meaningfully deep commentary on the nature of heroism or some other such hyperbolic self-importance. Now, that's not to say that superhero movies can't be grand, meaningful works of dramatic art as well. The Dark Knight was, Richard Donner's Superman was, Logan was, hell, I've even argued that The Avengers was, and of course part of the reason why Homecoming feels so insubstantial, as previously mentioned, is that we've already seen Spider-Man movies be substantial as hell, and it turns out they've cast a very long shadow. That's not to say that intentionally aiming for a slight story absolves Homecoming for being a mostly unengaging, almost disposable film either. Wonder Woman was a mostly formula origin story in the Thor mold that's nonetheless risen to be a cultural landmark by leaning hard into its subject's feminist iconhood at a precise moment where that team needed a bit of a pick-me-up. Doctor Strange didn't exactly break new ground narratively, it really is just Iron Man goes to Hogwarts when you get right down to it, but it did blow a lot of people's minds with genuinely new visuals. Even the intentionally glib and breezy Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 managed to catch audiences completely off guard with surprising emotional and thematic depth this year, though I guess you've got a lot of leeway to do that sort of thing when your setting allows for surrogate family uses the power of friendship to defeat the cosmic embodiment of patriarchy, colonialism, and toxic male entitlement to be the literal premise of your sequel. In the end, though, the fact remains that while I was, I guess, nominally disappointed and certainly not bowled over by Spider-Man Homecoming, it's a good enough film and I'm not really feeling all that put out about it. In fact, I'm coming around to the idea that letting some of these things be slight and disposable might be overall more healthy for the genre and for the culture at large. Thanks to the smoldering trash fire that still is the DC Extended Universe pre-Wonder Woman, we've seen what kind of disaster can unfold when you try to bludgeon the audience into accepting that a bloated, loud, dumb blockbuster is some kind of actually meaningful artifact, and a few more incidents like that could conceivably be enough to just burn everyone out on the whole concept. Look, as a production experiment, the Marvel Cinematic Universe thing is a historic success. It's been fun to watch Marvel transform the movie business into the comic book business, and it continues to be fun to notice all the continuity connections and character relationships and think back on the crossovers and the dopey magic rocks and how that all fits together. But just because all that stuff ideally helps create the momentary illusion that each new superhero adventure is part of something like the most important thing ever, doesn't mean that every single one of them needs to take up near-permanent residence in the forefront of your thoughts. That's not to say I don't wish Spider-Man Homecoming had at least had something in the way of actual dramatic heft, or that it won't be significantly less forgivable if the inevitable sequel is also a high-flavor, low-protein nothing burger of a movie, but I do like the idea of Marvel and Marvel fans getting comfortable with the MCU movies that don't demand to be obsessed over for however many months it takes for the next one to come out. And yeah, I guess Ant-Man technically already was like that too, and is a significantly better movie than this one, but that's another show. But nonetheless, I'm kinda glad to see it take shape as a trend. It means more overall variety for the superhero genre, and more free headspace for mainstream film culture to devote to an even greater variety of material. Period. Seriously though, the next one of these should probably be about something.